Yeah, thanks very much, Robin. And thanks everybody for lasting out the day thus far. So, as Robin said, I was at the Science Studies Unit from 1971 to 1974, when I found myself a job, a proper job, as everybody except academics questions it. I had an uncle who said to me, "When are you going to get a proper job?" When I was very pleased with myself for getting a lectureship at Lancaster University, where I basically hung around for 40 years with, you know, the odd year or two here and somewhere else, but basically at Lancaster. Actually, one of the somewhere else is I'm going to maybe use the little case study. So what I'm going to try and do, I think, you know, the history is important, but actually it's also very elaborate and too many layers to spend much time on in time-abbreviated circumstances. So I'm going to basically just try to draw upon and describe briefly, but then draw upon 3 or 4 case studies of issues where I've been involved as an STS scholar in policy issues. And sometimes it's been the policy issue that's dragged me into, not quite kicking and screaming, but sometimes getting on there, dragged me into that domain. And sometimes I've pushed into the domain because of my STS interests, or, you know, where PhD students maybe were obviously keen to go, and so on. But I want to then try to pull back out just to make some more general observations about those whole processes. And I guess, you know, the first thing I should say is a bit of a heavy qualification, is that, don't forget, I actually retired 8 years ago from Lancaster in 2014. And it feels to me like things were changing fast then, and not just in the political economy of universities and higher education, which is actually one of the reasons I retired. Thinking of, you know, a lot of other friends who did the same around about that period. But it also means that you're probably going to find some of my comments out of date. I hope not too far. I hope they might be just distantly recognizable maybe. But I've been thinking about this quite a lot since Robin asked me to come and do this. And the way that I understand the world and the way it's been changing, you know, with all the stuff about post-truth, etc., I think that actually the understanding of truth, lowercase t, that I was given here in Edinburgh, the foundations of that as it's developed over the latter 40 years or more, is pretty relevant. And I want to try and just share some of that if I can, and you can tell me how relevant, if at all, it is. So let's get going, because we've only got 20 minutes, and then hopefully some discussion. By the way, another point about old age, not with all old ages, but certainly for me, is that my eyesight has deteriorated a lot. And rather than keep on pulling off and pulling on different specs, one for long distance or medium distance at the back of the room, and one for my notes here in front of me, is that I can't use the same specs between the room and the notes. And I'm just going to use my reading specs, because they're the ones that really matter for me. But I love to basically talk to people. And that means being able to eyeball different people in the room. And with these on particularly, I'm afraid everyone's a little bit of a blur. So that kind of ambition fails on me. So apologies for that. Just very briefly, just making a few observations about the way that I arrived at the Science Studies unit in 1971 and, if you like, the intellectual state I was in at that time, and what the whole experience meant to me of those 3 years that I spent at the Science Studies unit back in Buccleuch Place in those days. A very, very small outfit. There were 3 fairly newly appointed, well, the whole unit was only then maybe 3 years old, 2 or 3 years old. The 3 lecturers in sociology, history, and philosophy of science were themselves, only newly there, really. They'd begun teaching, but guess what? They were teaching in the science faculty. The Science Studies unit was set up mainly to teach scientists about the world that they were going to be doing their science in. And they weren't part of humanities or social sciences in those days. And of course, ST is a very much bigger animal and a lot more diverse and far-reaching than the Science Studies unit ever was. And I came as an already practicing scientist. So I'd done my first degree and my PhD in natural sciences and then PhD in material science at Cambridge. And I didn't have a clue about what social science or humanities was all about. The idea of, differences between like scientific sociology or, interpretive sociology. When was that famous paper written about the 2 sociologies? Sometime when I was at the Science Studies unit, I think, learning the trade. I didn't know what those terms meant. I was that ignorant. I had no undergraduate training and no postgraduate training either in sociology, history, philosophy, anything. I was a materials scientist, and my first 3 CV publications are actually in materials physics and materials electrochemistry, actually, scientific journals. So that was important because what was then developing, thanks to Barry Barnes, David Bloor, Gary Werski, who was then the historian of science at the unit, soon to be replaced by Steve Shapin, they were developing the strong program in the sociology of scientific knowledge. And I'm not going to say much more about that at all, but it was a very controversial stance to be developing at that time, because it appeared on the face of it to be anti-science, anti-realist, and all of those much hated things that actually it wasn't. But it was a very particular take on scientific knowledge. And notice, by the way, technology only came into that kind of disciplinary heading during the 1980s, early 1980s. And Dave Collingridge, one of Robin's previous friends and colleagues, a friend of mine too, who died way too early, was also at the Aston, forgotten what it was called, Robin, but Dave Collingridge was part of that intellectual front which brought technology into the STS and our STIS framework. Pardon?
Science in the social context.
Syscon, yeah. That was something funded by Nuffield, wasn't it? But yeah, anyway, so the details we don't need to worry about. So the strong program in the sociology of scientific knowledge was what I encountered as a scientist when I came to Edinburgh. And I was probably only there because of David Edge's presence as director. David was himself actually recruited from the BBC as a science broadcaster, but he was himself a radio astronomer, postdoctoral radio astronomer at Cambridge University. So when I came to see him, first of all, actually when I was writing up my PhD at Cambridge, worried that all of my future career options in research looked like they were all to do with basically being a bit of a unit that was going to be building the military-industrial complex. I just thought, no, I don't want to spend my life doing that, thanks very much. And I didn't know what else to do. And a physicist friend at Cambridge said, go and see David Edge in Edinburgh. That was Pete Chapman, Robin, who later wrote the book Fuel's Paradise in the late 70s, early 80s, which was all about, the obsession with more and more production. What about demand-side policy management? So that's something that I want to stress in talking about STS and policy and where, what is our role? I shouldn't say what is, I should say what are our roles, because I'm really insistent there are plural roles that STS can play in different policy domains and issues. And actually some of them, when you look and say, well, where's the STS in that? That is actually a very good question, and I've often pondered that myself and not come up with any very clear or very substantial answer. Quite often, as I've actually said in these domains, when a sociologist or an STS person goes into those domains as an actor, invited or not invited, as the case may be, very often, as I've put it, from my own experience, what you're actually often inputting is upmarket common sense. And it might be given the label of, economics or STS or whatever else it is. But I often feel when push comes to shove, you haven't done very much more in that domain than just give them some good upmarket common sense. So that's trying to keep us down to earth. Let's get too kind of exaggerated about what our roles have been, even when it looks like we've made some impact. We being a collective, usually not an individual, but that's another question. So I had to learn the strong program and its essentials, and also try to understand why the hell it was so controversial. Because it was really attacked furiously, particularly by philosophers, but by lots of others. And actually a strong body of those were Marxist academics. Hilary and Stephen Rose, a couple of very good friends, now come to mind, but many others as well. And it was being attacked because it did seem to be anti-science. Now, David Bloor has written a lot, more, I think, than Barry or Steve Shapin on explaining why that isn't true. But nevertheless, it was taken to be those kind of, categorically unpopular properties, anti-realist, anti-science, relativist, that, scientists were not thought to be taking nature seriously. That's the way it was characterized. I think it was wrong. Many people think that was wrong, but it left itself open, let's say, to that kind of characterization, which was immediately, for the chop. So I didn't really have a clue why there was all this fuss. I was reading Thomas Kuhn and Karl Popper, Lakatos, and all of the philosophers of science. Kuhn, a historian of science, who also traded on philosophy of science name, and many others in that kind of debate at that time. But the one thing that I found after spending time here, going to their lectures, going to undergraduate lectures in sociology and politics, or government, I think it was called in those days, was that actually SSK, as developed at Edinburgh, was not really interested in scientific knowledge in public places, as I call it, or in public arenas. And the development of scientific knowledge in public arenas, not just its use after it had been developed somewhere else, a laboratory or a computer software department, whatever it might be, simulation models, etc., in, as it were, private scientific domains. That's really where SSK and the Strong Programme were focused. And I had come to Edinburgh already with an interest in scientific knowledge in other places. I mentioned, my antipathy, to put it mildly, to doing anything in my career that was going to just be a kind of, further weapon for the military-industrial complex. And so I wanted to develop into, try SSK out in other arenas, public arenas, where controversies over scientific knowledge and what it was telling policy, or said to be telling policy, to do, where those were actually issues. Why is there controversy in this or that domain? In those days it was over things like nuclear power. That's always been, an issue, at least since the early 70s. Weapons systems, which of course Donald Mackenzie went on to study and got loads of prizes for inventing accuracy in 1989. So I was straining to both support, develop SSK in different ways into public domains, and particularly into controversies, very often over the science of risk assessment. So one of my earliest public issue engagements as an STS, by then I was an STS graduate of Edinburgh, or sociology and history of science graduate, because I'd done my MPhil, for which I had to register when I came. I wasn't really that bothered about doing it because I'd already got a PhD anyway. And in fact, my external examiner, when I submitted my MPhil, Roy Porter, said, if you'd registered that for an MPhil, I'd have given you a PhD. So, sorry, if you'd registered it for a PhD, you'd have got a PhD for that. And I thought, well, that's a bit extravagant, 2 PhDs. But the point was really that I left Edinburgh going to Lancaster with an MPhil in sociology of science, and it was all actually following David and Barry, David Bloor, on the Strong Programme. It was all actually an internalist history of C.G. Barkler, an Edinburgh Nobel Prize winner in physics in the early 20th century, who was unknown because he'd gone off on a tack with a particular theory and become discredited for that reason. But I was, in that sense, fully consistent with David and Barry in the Strong Programme in following and studying scientific knowledge in private scientific arenas. And so it was when I went to Lancaster, and I'd already met Dorothy Nelkin, one of the big American sociologists of science of those days, who had loads of PhD students, some of whom are still around, or actually Shelley Krimsky, one of her students, died quite recently, but studying controversies of different kinds. And they're in edited books edited by Dorothy Nelkin. Controversy, I think, is the title of her most cited book anyway. But what was interesting about that kind of study of controversies as policy study from STS was that Dr. Nelkin taught her students that the only kind of dynamic or dimension of these issues that created controversy, conflict, often unresolved for decades, was that the parties had different interests. So it was a very conventional, rational choice, American-style political science, understanding of scientific knowledge in public arenas. And having been at the Science Studies Unit, I wanted to broaden that and change it. And so I realized that actually I was becoming, this was only a kind of post hoc self-understanding, an interpretivist, sociologist of scientific knowledge. And I was interested in meanings. And that's very different from that kind of rational choice basis. And of course leads into lots of new domains of questions for researching and interpretation and understanding. And it's often very, very messy and uncomfortable to be in those places, particularly when, as I was also doing, I was kind of pushing myself into policy arenas where there was controversy. Just excuse me a sec. My voice is very soft and it's struggling a bit too, so is it okay at the back? Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. Shout up if you can't. Yeah. So one of the things that I went into was the Wynne scale public inquiry, which I actually identified as the kind of case study of controversy that Dorothy Nelkin had been studying for quite a while and had a lot of case studies under her belt. Her book, Controversy, I think the first edition was the late 70s. So not long after I'd left Edinburgh and only kind of got to grips with a strong program, and then tried to drive it into broader arenas where publics were involved and where public authority was a key question, a key issue to understand. So at the public inquiry, which was, it was an achievement on the part of publics even to establish a public inquiry. The Labour government at that time didn't want it. They just thought nuclear is it, so we're going for it. And that inquiry, you may not know about it, but it was a public inquiry into the oxide fuels reprocessing plant at Sellafield. And oxide fuels were a new kind of nuclear spent fuel, which hadn't been reprocessed successfully anywhere else in the world. So it's quite a controversial thing. And British Nuclear Fuels, the outfit which ran Sellafield, was kind of notorious already by the mid-70s. It had already had several accidents at the Sellafield, the existing reprocessing plant, and it was proposing a new one with fuel that was even more radioactively intense, higher burn-up, as the nukes call it. And so I actually ended up acting for a group of local opponents. I was a registered objector along with the organisations I was representing. And I had to act as effectively a barrister on behalf of this disparate local group, and to find funds for 3 scientific witnesses at the inquiry, run by a High Court judge, and very, very formally legal in terms of its processes and the interactions. So, every witness for each party had to write a statement which was then on record, in the public domain and available to all your opposition parties so that they could then cross-examine you and take you to the cleaners. And I had to learn this new trade just on the hoof. And so clubby was maybe the British establishment, that I actually had the QC acting for British nuclear fuels, so my direct opponent in this quasi-legal courtroom type environment, public inquiry, with all the media, the press agents sat down the side of the room, filing their copy at 2 or 3 in the afternoon for the next day's newspapers. And they were often quoting from us in those newspaper pieces about us. That would never happen these days. Completely different kind of process in the media themselves. But I actually had, after my first cross-examination session with a BNFL witness, I actually had David Silso, Lord Silso, the QC for BNFL, taking me out to lunch. After the session had finished, he said, "Come on, Brian, let's go for lunch. I want to teach you a few things about cross-examination." So I was learning my trade in order to oppose the nuclear industry from their barrister at the public inquiry in front of a High Court judge and a fellow of the Royal Society, Sir Fred Warner, as an engineer, expert assessor for the judge, and a radiobiologist, Edward Pochin, as the other assessor. And that's just how clubby that whole environment was. On a Friday, after we'd finished the sessions for the afternoon, those that were staying for the weekend, all the London barristers went home to London. But we actually went to Whitehaven Grammar School, which BNFL had commandeered as their base for doing all their admin work, which was huge, around the inquiry and feeding it to the inquiry. And we had a 5-a-side football league between the different parties, including BNFL, Cumbria County Council, the Isle of Man government, because they were opposing it on the grounds of damage to their fishing industry and tourism, and so it went on. That was the nature of the informal human interaction. And meanwhile, I was trying to build an environmental case as I went along for the inquiry, because the standard environmentalist case was, well, the Thorpe plant, as it was called, the thermal oxide reprocessing plant, not in existence, it was being proposed. It was an imaginary, in that sense, of the nuclear industry. These are all over the place around me. So we had to basically make a case which was, I went against a lot of the environmentalists at the inquiry because they were trying to say it's unsafe and we can prove it. And I said to them, and how are we going to prove it when it doesn't exist? What are you talking about? You can't disprove an imaginary or a promise. You might be able to do so in 10 years' time, but that's not now. This inquiry is happening today, tomorrow, and actually for another 4 months beyond that, as it turned out. But I had to then try and build a case on some other documents that we'd found, which was actually documenting the promises that BNFL had made about their earlier plant, Yeah, Neil's telling me to shut up, so I'll do my best. I just finished this example, and then we'll go from there. So my case had to be something which was documenting, and here I was lucky, because I documented those promises of the discharge levels from that previous plant, which was now operating. It had been operating by 1977 for 7 or 8 years, since about 1971. So I compared those promised emissions into the Irish Sea and the atmosphere with the actual emissions, which were then documented in Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries annual monitoring and data and so on, very fully documented. And I could show that actually the existing discharges and, for the past few years, were orders of magnitude bigger than those that they had originally promised. And my argument wasn't one about risk and safety. It was one about trust. How can we trust the promises they're now making for Thorpe as being very much cleaner than the Magnox plant, when the only promises we've got, their track record just refutes their own claims and promises. And I tried to put this to the judge, and it completely failed. I thought it was a pretty good abstract argument to just, to have made up, obviously in conversation with a lot of friends in the anti-thought movement or anti-nuclear movement. But it went precisely nowhere with the judge. And instead of that, he actually went out and demanded that there should be scientific monitoring of the particular parts of the environment, including another place, Ravenglass Estuary, where there was a new phenomenon, resuspension of radioactive alpha emitter contaminated silt on those estuaries. Ravenglass is a tourist village, literally 100 yards, 200 yards from those silt beds. Judge Parker insisted on monitoring of those silt beds, and I tried to protest and was just wiped out. He just told me what he was going to do, and that was that. And he was going to have scientific monitoring done of those silt beds and Ravenglass Village to test my argument. It had nothing to do with my argument. And that is how empiricist, scientific Justice Parker, the High Court judge running the inquiry, was right through the whole inquiry. The nuclear scientists from BNFL themselves agreed with me about how he'd actually, shifted to a different question and just redefined my question without acknowledging it. They agreed with me. And this is the interesting thing about, this head-to-head battle going on for 4 months into huge detail of technical evidence and counter-evidence and so on. And even your scientific opponents are actually agreeing with you on certain key points, and yet no impact whatsoever. So that's just one example. There were many more. I wrote it all up in the book that I did on the inquiry. But the point about that is that, this and other cases I've been involved in has often been described as STS's success in policy, in gaining influence in policy domains. And I'm afraid I always, nearly always, pretty well always, have to say, look again. It's very rare that we actually gain influence that cleanly and that simply, in a way. It wasn't simple at all, but it's nearly always, if there is success, and there were some successes of that kind in a different issue, the GMOs issue, in the early 20th century, late 90s, early 21st century But they were very temporary, really, very limited and temporary. And things have gone even further in the direction of deregulation under the current government, and will probably go further still too. So I think the first thing is asking about STS and policy. Policy is a multi-headed monster, of course, you know, and you're acting with other actors. And as someone mentioned in a session earlier on, you know, those actors may be nothing to do with government actors, policy actors. They might be industry, there might be civil society, there might be a whole range of different other policy actors. And it's really important to try, first of all, you've got to try and understand that policy world before you can hope to have any kind of intelligent impact upon it. The other thing about policy and impact like the fashion term in REF for a long time now, is the simple model of impact which is carried in policy and in higher education actually too, which is you do some research and you publish it, and if you're lucky or if you direct it in the right directions in a strategic fashion, your research will have impact. And then you can make a big claim for REF that's going to get you lots of baubles and wonderful credits in the REF process. I couldn't even, I've often tried, and I've been asked to for REF impact purposes, which was still on the go just before my retirement. I did one with John Urry, bless him, as the coordinator of it. And I just could not fit my understanding of my impact into the template which the ESRC and HEFKI, I guess, had actually created to recognize impact. It just, you could not fit it into that model. Because I was often going into policy domains to do research as well as to act. That's what I did at the Wynne scale inquiry. And that's what I've done in pretty well all the cases where I've been involved as an STS scholar in policy domains.
Okay.
So a lot of things to...
We should probably wind up now. The
question.
time is
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry.
So
And thanks, Niels, for
but without,
control.
I think we should move straight from this into the next session and have a discussion of Brian's contribution in conjunction with the next session, which is actually a question and answer discussion. So that's been very interesting. If we skip discussion now, hang on to your thoughts or the next session. First of all, thank you very much. That was really